welcome to this objective, which is, excuse me, learning objective 3 for chapter 15. In this particular learning objective, what we're going to look at is the idea of how do we decide if the government changes its spending patterns through fiscal, either in this case, I'll say expansionary policies. What effect does that have on consumers? Because obviously, if you're not paying as much taxes, then you're going to have more income from which to make decisions. So let's go ahead and jump into our show. Find it easily here. There we go. Share my screen with you. So we're going to look at one variable, which is called the marginal propensity to consume. We'll also look at the marginal propensity to save and see how those two basically work out. So what is the spending multiplier? And the spending multiplier is if we have a change in aggregate demand, and I'm going to say, because we're talking about fiscal policy in this chapter. So if the government increases taxes, decreases spending, then we're going to have less, and aggregate demand, there we go, will shift inward and to the right. But how far? That becomes our question. If the government has expansionary fiscal policies and they decrease taxes and increase spending, aggregate demand will shift outward. But how far? And what will be the overall effect on the economy? Now, I'm going to hold these, excuse me, elasticities, which is the kind of slope of the aggregate demand curve here, constant. That's not true in real life. But again, you can see how this is a lot more difficult than when we look at normal. This is in real life, it's a lot more difficult than looking at it here in textbook land. So again, we could look at the change in things like, again, what's going to happen with consumption? What will happen for investment? Yes, it will be affected, but at a later time. Government spending and net exports. For our purposes, we're going to just look at government spending and consumption, because we're looking at the consumption aspect of this as well as, and then it does trickle into investment and some of these other things as well. This, but by how far will aggregate demand shift, is called the multiplier effect. So suppose if the government buys 20 billion of planes from Boeing, Boeing's revenue will increase by 20 billion. So here we have the government increasing purchases. Okay. Now we know, because you always have to keep this idea in mind, real GDP is made up of consumption plus government expenditures plus investments plus net export. So if the government increases its consumption by buying these planes from Boeing, then Boeing will have additional revenue. This is distributed throughout the economy to their workers, owners, and things like dividends and so on. Some people are consumers and will spend that. So when we look at this in terms of Boeing's workers, they're going to have more money because of the government doing buying, increasing their purchases, so they can consume at a greater rate. How much more? So we not only see the initial shift that happens here from the government increasing government purchases, the initial shift of aggregate demand, remember price levels over here, and real output is here. But we're also going to see some trickle effects, if you will. Okay, so this multiplier effect will show us how we have additional shifts in aggregate demand beyond the very first initial, in this case, expansion in government spending. So here we have the multiplier effect illustrated. We have an aggregate demand. We have the price level. Remember, that's our inflation. We have real output, real GDP down here. The government buys the planes. So the first thing that we happen is aggregate demand would shift outward by the 20 billion. That's the government aspect of this. So what caused us to move from Y1 to Y2? That's the government increasing its expenditures. The increase in that will cause consumption to rise. Again, who? Basically Boeing's employees and so on, which will shift this farther to the right. And again, here we're kind of interested in how much farther. So what is the secondary effects of the government increasing its spending? And that's what we use this multiplier effect for. Now, the multiplier effect is made up of the marginal propensity to consume. If you have an extra dollar, how much of that dollar will you spend? How much of that dollar will you save? We're going to assume and could draw some constraints around people. And we're saying if an extra dollar comes into the households, there are two things that that household can do with it. They can spend it and put it back out into the economy. And let's say 50% of it they spend, or they could save it. And let's say 50% they're going to save. These two make up the spending multiplier, but we're going to start with how much of the money would citizens consume. So the marginal propensity to consume is the multiplier effect. And the fraction of extra income that we consume rather than save. So if our marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, think of it this way. If a dollar comes in, we're going to spend 80 cents of that. If income rises by 100, you get a raise of $100, then consumption is going to increase by 0.8 times 100, which gives us $80. If we're thinking of it as a dollar, we're going to spend 80 cents out of every dollar coming into the household. Where did that dollar come from? It came from the government increasing its purchasing. So how do we express this mathematically? Basically, the marginal propensity to consume is the change in consumption spending divided by their change in income. So what is the extra income? And then what's their marginal propensity to and the change in consumption spending. So again, is that 0.8? They're going to spend 80 cents out of every dollar. And how much is the extra income coming in? So we can boil this down into a multiplier. For you, I think I'm just wanting you to understand that where this comes from, not necessarily to calculate the multiplier. So remember, the change in G is the governmental spending. So if we're going to, I'm just going to use expansionary fiscal policy. So if the government increases its spending, then we will see that because aggregate demand shifts outward, there will be a change in real GDP, and there will be a change in consumption. And the ultimate will be the change in real GDP, the change in consumption. Where do those two things come from? They come from the increase in the government spending. So if we start with the national income identity, which is how we calculate real GDP, we can take a look at this. And again, I'm going to isolate the two variables that I'm interested in right now. I'm interested in consumption and government spending. So if government spending increases, they really want to know, how is this going to help out the economy in the short term, and then I and then X are in the longer term. But so we're interested in the change in consumption plus the change in government spending. We're going to hold the investment and net exports constant at this time. So when we look at this, we can say the change in real GDP is equal to the marginal propensity to consume, whatever that is. And then we have the change in real GDP plus the change in government spending. We can boil it down even farther because the constant in this equation is the change in real GDP. We can actually get rid of that by dividing the change in real GDP by both sides of the equation. And we're left with, ready, the multiplier. And the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay. Now, in our case, we're not going to be calculating the marginal propensity to consume. We're not going to have to do that because that's a little higher level mathematics than what we're going to use in our course. So if we're given a marginal propensity to consume, we can kind of look at what are the net effects of that. Okay. So the size of the multiplier really depends on this marginal propensity to consume. So if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5, what you would do is put 0.5 right here. 1 minus 0.5 is 0.5, 1 over 0.5. And the multiplier here would end up being 2. That's how we get the multiplier effect. If marginal propensity to consume, the multiplier would be 4. So what you're hopefully seeing here is the higher the marginal propensity to consume, the greater the multiplier effect. Now, what is it that we're talking about again? If the multiplier is higher, what will happen is that initial, we have aggregate demand here, our initial government expenditures will push it outward once to aggregate demand 2. I'm sorry, aggregate demand 1. And then if the multiplier is 0.9, that's going to push aggregate demand way out here. Okay. So we're interested in the how far out, and that's what this multiplier effect is telling us. Okay. All right. So other applications that we can use in the multiplier effect, I'm not so interested if you know this, but $1 increase in government spending can generate more than $1 increase in demand. Okay, so that's true. We could also look at things like net exports, and we could also look at things like investments in that respect. The marginal propensity to save is the reciprocal of the marginal propensity to consume. Remember, I said that in a household, you can do 2 things. You can spend it or you can save it. So it always equals 1, because if we have $1 coming in, how is that $1 portioned out? Going back to my previous example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, then 80 cents out of every $1 will be put into consumption, whereas 20 cents will be in savings. So here's an example. Again, the marginal propensity to save is just 1 over the marginal propensity to consume, because they have to equal 1. Okay, that's the end of this learning objective. If you're a little concerned about the math, don't be, because I just want you to understand where these things come from, and that the multiplier really shows that second shift in aggregate demand. Now, I chose to use expansionary fiscal policies here to explain this, but it could also be contractionary fiscal policies as well. So this is the precision that the government uses when they are engaging in expansionary or contractional fiscal policy. Look forward to talking to you in our next objective.